Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. I wanted to do this little video. I wanted to do this little topic because I found this topic very particularly interesting. And this is yet again going to be another topic about Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez. And the reason why I do so many videos on Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, certain people may wonder. Keep in mind, all in all, that when it comes to this channel, that I pride myself in being a very decently logical and objective person. And even though I may like certain fighter styles and I may like certain athletes because I find them very, very entertaining, I do pride myself in not being a fanboy in any of these athletes. And the reason why that is because that would ruin my logic and objectivity. So anytime something happens, you're going to get the most fair and upright logical conclusion from that of me, at least the best way that I can. But anyways, Mr. Canelo Alvarez, of course, as we know, ended up losing his last fight, in my view, somewhat dominantly to that of the light heavyweight champion of the world, Dimitri Bivol. And I thought that it was a very great challenge for Canelo Alvarez because Dimitri Bivol, in my view, is one of the only true fighters out there that actually had a realistic chance against him and Artur Beterbiev. But, that's not me saying that the David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo fights are not great fights. It's just me saying that I don't think that they have the same opportunity of beating Canelo or giving him as much of a challenge as what a Dimitri Bivol or Artur Beterbiev would give him. But basically, overall, just moving on from that topic, Canelo Alvarez, of course, ended up losing his last fight. And whenever a fighter, whenever a boxer especially loses a fight, you always have certain people, in fact, the majority of fans will probably turn against that fighter. And the reason why that is because they'll say, you disappointed me. You did not live up to my expectations. And now basically I have to kick you to the curb. And so, of course, you are going to get a certain amount of people that say bad things now about Canelo Alvarez, just as they said about Deontay Wilder, just as they said about Vasily Lomachenko, just as they said once upon a time about many other fighters who ended up losing. I'm sure they said the same thing about Muhammad Ali when he ended up losing to Joe Frazier, that he was a hype job, that he was nowhere near as good as overall what many people claim to be. The bottom line is this, especially when you're on a very, very high level, people are basically going to attack you from the woodwork. And especially with a certain amount of these channels, that do not like Canelo Alvarez, like that of the LDBC and new media, you're going to get a certain amount of people, of course, that spread certain narratives. And on this channel, that's mainly overall what I kind of like to do. I like to counter certain narratives that I believe are somewhat out of proportion. But anyways, this video, and before I really get into the video, just to talk about some of the videos that I am going to post a little bit later on. I'm going to post more boxing videos, certainly. Probably maybe some news about Terrence Bud Crawford and the Errol Spence Jr. situation. Deontay Wilder, possibly. Devin Haney, George Kambosos fight predictions. Certainly, I will post that within the next few days, more than likely. Could be today, could be within the next couple days. We'll see what happens there. I also am going to be talking about maybe a little bit about tennis and also that about some NBA basketball. So for some of you guys that, want to see some of those conversations, certainly tune in and keep a lookout for those. But anyways, just to continue this conversation, Marco Antonio Barrera, who of course was one of the greater Mexican fighters of all time and certainly one of the greater fighters of his generation, he stated something that I thought was very interesting to talk about. And he said that he believes that it's actually too early to call Canelo Alvarez a great fighter. And to a degree, I can somewhat understand where he's coming from. But I don't know overall if I can necessarily agree with that statement. And the reason why that is because even though Canelo Alvarez's career is not finished, you can tell when a fighter, because of the accomplishments that they have and what they've been able to do in their career, in their career, you can tell when a fighter is not only a great fighter, you can tell when they're an all-time great fighter. And I think that Canelo Alvarez truly is an all-time great fighter because for the first few years of the 2020s, he was the number one pound for pound fighter, or at least overall, the first couple of years. And also when you talk about the 2010s, you can argue that he probably was the second best all-around pound for pound fighter behind Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now, some people may say, well, what about Manny Pacquiao? Manny Pacquiao was a terrific fighter even during the 2010s, but I just don't know if I would argue that Manny Pacquiao was as dominant during the 2010s as what he was during the 2000s. But would I rank Manny Pacquiao in terms of greatness over Canelo just because of what he's accomplished? Yeah, I probably would. But when it comes down to this conversation, I just thought that this conversation was particularly interesting, especially when we compare Canelo Alvarez to other all-time great Mexican fighters. Because a certain amount of these channels that I see, they basically are from an emotional standpoint, and that's the majority of people. They don't really overall think that logically and objectively. They think more emotionally and irrationally than what they do logically and rationally. And what a lot of these channels you'll say, I noticed, mainly from Dante's Boxing Nation and Boxing Ego, they'll say, oh, well, you guys try to compare Canelo Alvarez to Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales and Juan Manuel Marquez and, Julio Cesar Chavez, all these all-time great Mexican fighters. Well, they don't really truly admire any of those all-time great Mexican fighters because we all know what those channels are already about. The only reason why they're mainly saying that is because they want to make it seem that Canelo Alvarez is not an all-time great fighter because they want to make sure that there is no possible chance that Canelo Alvarez is going to regain that number one pound for pound spot. That is their main objective at the end of the day. So it just is what it is. It's not a coincidence that they've been trying to tear down Canelo Alvarez, especially ever since he made that number one pound for pound spot. Which of course now in my view he's somewhat lost now that he lost to Dimitri Bivol. But just to talk about that situation really quickly, if we were to compare Canelo Alvarez to other all-time great Mexican fighters or other great Mexican fighters, and once again, I've already said this a multitude of times, Canelo Alvarez, in my view, when you compare him to other Mexican fighters, there's really only one Mexican fighter in the history of Mexico or the Mexican-American fighters that you really can even compare, Canelo Alvarez to, and that would be Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. And I know a lot of people, they may not necessarily agree with that, but that is the only Mexican fighter, in my view, that you can really compare with Canelo Alvarez. And the reason why that is because if we take a look at Juan Manuel Marquez, Marco Antonio Barrera, and Eric Morales, although as great as what they were, Oscar De La Hoya, I'll bring him up as well, as great as what those fighters were, they were not on the Canelo Alvarez level. They were not on the Canelo Alvarez level. And if you're a person that ended up growing up within a certain generation, if you're a person that grew up in the 2000s and 2010s watching those fighters, you're probably going to have a little bit of an emotional issue, debatably, with that. And you're probably going to say, oh, well, this fighter and this fighter and this fighter wasn't greater than those fighters. Because a lot of the times, depending on when we grow up and depending on what we hear from a very, very young age, we almost have a certain emotional attachment to them. For example, when I see certain NBA debates, I remember one NBA debate that was on ESPN First Take, and they were debating about who the greater player was between that of a Stephen Curry and an Allen Iverson. Allen Iverson, for whatever reason, is remembered way, way greater than what he actually was. And it's almost a very similar situation to when people try to say that Canelo Alvarez, that he's not as great as Marco Antonio Barrera or Eric Morales or Juan Manuel Marquez. It's no offense against any of those fighters, and Oscar De La Hoya. It's no offense against any of those fighters. But they were not the fighter of what a Canelo Alvarez was. They did not accomplish what a Canelo Alvarez was able to accomplish. Canelo has been able to get A-grade name after A-grade name after A-grade name. Canelo, overall, was given the title at one point in time as being looked at as the number one pound-for-pound fighter, the true and unanimous number one pound-for-pound fighter. None of those other fighters were looked at as the number one pound-for-pound fighter of their day. There may have been a slight argument for Oscar De La Hoya back in the 90s, but it really wasn't him. It was Roy Jones Jr. So at the end of the day, Canelo has to be looked at on a different level because Canelo Alvarez has won the majority of the big fights of his career. The two fights that he for sure ended up losing, one was against a light heavyweight that was naturally bigger than him and an A-grade skilled fighter. The other one was the best fighter probably of the past 20 plus years against the Floyd Mayweather Jr. When you take a look against Marco Antonio Barrera, he lost to a multitude of fighters, not even just some of the best of his generation. But Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales and Juan Manuel Marquez, for you to allege overall that those fighters were greater than that of a Canelo Alvarez, you would have to allege that those fighters were at least the second best fighter of their generation, and they weren't. They probably weren't even within the top five. Maybe Oscar De La Hoya for the 90s, but when you talk about Juan Manuel Marquez, now maybe he would have been top five for his generation. But Juan Manuel Marquez, when you take a look at the losses of his career, he ended up losing the majority of the fights to a Manny Pacquiao. All right, and if it would have not been for a stupid mistake by Manny Pacquiao in the fourth fight, he probably would have got knocked out. When you talk about Marco Antonio Barrera, he ended up losing to Eric Morales once. He also ended up losing to Manny Pacquiao in very dominant fashion, 2 times by knockout, I believe. He also ended up getting knocked out by Junior Jones, a fighter that not a lot of people remember back in the day. All right, when you talk about Oscar De La Hoya, he ended up losing to Shane Mosley 2 separate times, even though the second time I thought was a bit controversial. He also ended up losing to Felix Tito Trinidad, and he also ended up losing to Bernard Hopkins. So in a lot of these fighters, for you to allege that, well, they're clearly greater than Canelo, Canelo's not on their same level, well, is that really the truth, or is that something that is more based in emotion than you just trying to push a narrative? Once again, it's very, very similar to that of the NBA narrative that I seen a few years ago when Stephen A. Smith and Max Kellerman, I believe, or maybe it was someone else, they were trying to debate about who the greater NBA player was between that of a Stephen Curry and an Allen Iverson. In my opinion, there's no doubt in my mind who is the greater player. It's Stephen Curry, and really, to be quite honest with you, it's really not even that close. But if you tell a lot of Allen Iverson fans that, or a lot of people who ended up growing in the early 2000s, growing up in the early 2000s, and watching basketball in the early 2000s, they'll say, "Oh no, you're crazy, man! You can't even compare the two." Well, I agree, you can't compare the two because Stephen Curry is actually about 10 times greater than what Allen Iverson was. He has more MVPs. He's been to more finals. He's a 3-time NBA champion. He's a better all-around player than what Allen Iverson was. And overall, he has higher basketball IQ. And he's more proficient. All right, so it is what it is. So my point of this video is this. A lot of people, of course, will take a look at a perspective. And all in all, more than likely, they're taking a look at it more emotionally and irrationally than what they are logically. We have to always take a look at things logically. And we have to sit here and say, okay, is this something that actually, all in all, is someone of the truth, or is this maybe a little bit of an overrated narrative? And the narrative that Canelo Alvarez is not even on the same level as an Oscar De La Hoya, or Juan Manuel Marquez, or an Eric Morales or Marco Antonio Barrera. No, I'm sorry, I can't agree with that narrative. And even with Marco Antonio Barrera saying what he said about it's too early to call Canelo Alvarez a great fighter, no, I don't think that it's too early to call him a great fighter at all. And do I believe that Marco Antonio Barrera was hating on Canelo with that? I'm not quite so sure. I would have to see it with a little bit more context. I somewhat understand where he is coming from, but you can tell who is a great athlete even overall before their career ends. We can take a look at the NFL right now, and when you take a look overall at someone like a Russell Wilson, I can sit here and say, oh, well, his career really hasn't ended, so I can't really determine, all in all, really if he is a great quarterback. We know damn well that if Russell Wilson retired today, that he would be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And it's the same thing with Canelo Alvarez. Canelo is not just a first ballot Hall of Famer. He is an all-time great fighter. I'll say it again, an all-time great fighter. And to allege that Oscar De La Hoya or Marco Antonio Barrera or Juan Manuel Marquez or Eric Morales, that any of those fighters would have been above Canelo, you would have to argue that they won the majority of their big fights. And they didn't compared to Canelo Alvarez. And those are the facts of the situation. And there's certain fighters that you can tell even today to where they're not all-time great fighters, but they look like they have all-time great ability. Now, if we were talking about certain fighters, let's say on the top 10 pound-for-pound list for now, that to me, they look like they have all-time great ability, but I can't really call them great or all-time great yet because they don't have the resume. That may be certain fighters like that of a Alexander Usyk or maybe a Vasily Lomachenko. Certain fighters overall like a Terrence Bud Crawford, or maybe certain fighters like that of a Gervonta Tank Davis. Certain fighters that, with their resume especially, they have more proving to do. But Canelo Alvarez, even though, of course, he has more proving to do in his career because I think that he wants to do this for years upon years upon years, with what he has accomplished, if Canelo Alvarez retired today, he would be an all-time great fighter. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. But that's pretty much about it for this video. I just thought that I would talk about that because I just thought that it would be very particularly interesting. And I think that it's always very, very important to rank things logically and objectively. But it is what it is. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later, and we will see where Mr. Canelo Alvarez goes from here. But that's about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.